The candle in Eleanor Voss's hand threw shadows up the clay walls, and for a moment she stood perfectly still at the bottom of the shaft and listened to the world trying to kill everything above her. It was 2 in the morning on January 12th, 1888. 15 feet of Dakota earth pressed in on all sides. The thermometer she had borrowed from the schoolteacher in Beaver Creek read 37 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the wind had been screaming for 12 hours at 60 miles an hour, and the last reading she had taken at the cabin wall before the mercury dropped too fast to follow had been 31 degrees below zero, 65 degrees in 7 hours. She held the candle closer to the nearest wooden bin. The potatoes sat in the slats exactly as she had placed them in October, firm, pale, untouched by cold or rot. She pressed her thumb into one. It did not yield. She moved to the carrot boxes packed in dry straw, pulled one free, held it up to the light. Still crisp, still whole. The cabbages hung from the ceiling on their ropes, heads down, exactly as she had tied them. Not one showed the soft brown bruise of freeze damage. Eleanor Voss sat down on an overturned crate and cried. She did not cry because she had won. She cried because 15 years of carrying a particular memory had finally, at the bottom of a hole she had dug with her own hands, released its grip on her. She cried because the last time she had opened a cellar door expecting food and found only ruin. Her brother Henry had been 9 years old, and the name she had whispered into the frozen dark of that Iowa winter had never once stopped echoing. But that was the end of the story, or near it. The beginning was 5 months earlier on a hot August afternoon when a woman past 50 stood at the edge of a half-finished hole and made a decision that everyone she knew told her would kill her. She had arrived in Yankton County, Dakota Territory in August of 1887 with a farm wagon, 2 mules named Luther and Grace, $43 folded into a leather pouch sewn into the lining of her dress, and a grief she had not yet decided what to do with. Thomas Voss had died of fever on the 14th of June, 2 weeks after cutting the first cottonwood timber for the cabin he had planned on their claim along Beaver Creek. He had been 54 years old, a quiet man with large, careful hands, and a habit of reading seed catalogs in the evenings as though they were scripture. Eleanor had sat with him through 5 days of the fever and watched him go the way hard men went on the frontier, slowly. And then all at once, without complaint and without much in the way of last words, the neighbors who came to help bury him had been kind. The Bergmans brought food. Clara Whitmore sat with Eleanor the first 2 nights, and Harold Brandt, whose claim ran along the northern edge of the Voss land, had offered to buy her a train ticket back to wherever she had come from. Minnesota, she had told him, by way of Iowa before that. Minnesota, then, he had said, not unkindly. You cannot work this land alone, Mrs. Voss. It is not a question of will. It is a question of what the country requires, and the country requires more than one pair of hands. Eleanor had thanked him for coming and gone inside. She was 52 years old. She was not going back to Minnesota. The land office clerk had looked at her twice when she filed the claim, first to transfer it from Thomas's name to her own, then again as she signed, as though checking the signature against some private idea of who ought to be signing it. He was a young man with a precise center part in his brown hair, and he studied the paperwork with the expression of someone hunting for errors that were not actually there. 160 acres, he said. That is correct, and you will be working it alone. I will. He stamped the paper. He slid it across the counter. He did not wish her luck, which she appreciated because she had no particular use for luck. She had $43, 2 mules, a half-finished cabin, with 4 walls of cottonwood logs and no floor, and no proper roof, and an idea that had been forming in the back of her mind since she had stood at the edge of her dead husband's unfinished cellar and measured its depth with a length of rope. 3 feet. The rope told her 3 feet, the same as every other cellar in Beaver Creek, the same as her father's cellar in Iowa, the same as the cellar that had held 3 feet of depth and 4 feet of frost on the night everything went wrong. Eleanor coiled the rope in her palm and stood at the edge of the hole for a long time, and the prairie wind moved the grass around her, and somewhere a meadowlark made its long falling call. And she thought about a winter 26 years before that no one in this country had any reason to remember. Iowa, February of 1862. Eleanor had been 7 years old, the eldest girl, and the winter had been the kind that old men afterward used as a measuring stick for every winter that followed. It had started in November with 3 weeks of dry, hard cold that cracked fence rails, then eased through December into a stretch of weather, almost soft enough to call a thaw. Her father, a man named Gideon Pratt, who farmed 80 acres of black Iowa bottomland, had stood in the doorway one gray morning and looked at the sky with suspicion. The wolves smile before they bite, he had said. She had not understood him until February. The frost that came in the second week of that month went deeper than her father had planned for, deeper than 4 feet of packed earth, and good banking had ever needed to hold before. It went to 4 feet in the open fields. It went to 4.5 in the places where the wind had blown the snow thin and left the ground exposed to the killing air. Their cellar was 3 feet deep. Eleanor had been the one to open the door that first gray morning when her mother sent her down for potatoes. She still remembered the weight of the handle in her small hand. She remembered the smell, not cold, not clean, but something wrong, something sweet and rotten at once. She had lifted the lantern and seen the potatoes in their bins, each one black and sunken in its skin. The carrots had gone glassy. The turnips had cracked open like drop crockery. Every jar of preserved fruit along the south wall had frozen and burst, leaving sticky, dried blooms of blackberry and plum smeared across the shelf. Her youngest brother, Henry, was 2 years old. That February, too young to understand, old enough to be hungry. He was the one who suffered most as the weeks wore on and the food the neighbors could share ran thinner and thinner. He had not died that winter. He had been small and stubborn, and he had lived. But Eleanor had watched the fear move through the house like a draft under the door, and she had heard her mother weeping in the night. And she had learned at 7 years old the precise arithmetic that governed life on a farm, in a hard country that everything you needed to survive the winter could be destroyed in a single night if the hole you kept it in was not deep enough. 11 years later, Henry had not been so lucky. The winter of 1873 took him. He was 13 by then, thin-legged and serious, with a habit of collecting flat creek stones and carrying them in his coat pockets. And when the family's stores failed again, the same way, the same depth, the same frost, reaching down past the same 3 feet. He had given his share to the younger ones without being asked, in the quiet way of a boy who had decided something and would not be talked out of it. He took a fever and the hunger, and there was nothing left to feed it back with, and he died on the 3rd of March. Eleanor was 17. She had been the one to find him gone in the morning, and she remembered more than anything the way her father had carried Henry out to the wagon, with both arms, fingers spread wide across the boy's narrow back, pressing as though he might force warmth back into a body that had none left to take it. She had promised herself standing in that Iowa farmyard in the March mud that she would never trust a 3-foot cellar again. She had kept that promise for 15 years by having enough, by planning carefully, by never once cutting the depth short. And now Thomas had died in June and left her with a 3-foot hole and the whole weight of a Dakota winter coming down on her. And she understood with sudden cold clarity that all her careful planning had always every single time depended on someone else doing the digging. Now she would have to do it herself. She picked up the shovel. The settlement at Beaver Creek had grown quickly since the land rush opened the territory in 1879. There were perhaps 40 families within riding distance of the general store Germans and Scandinavians, mostly with a scattering of folk from Ohio and Pennsylvania, who had come west in the boom years with New World hope and old country stubbornness in roughly equal measure. Most of them had arrived after the worst of it after 80 and 81, when the territory had shown plainly what it could do to the unprepared. Most of them had built their first cellars exactly the way they had been shown to build them 3 feet deep. Well-banked, packed around the outside with prairie sod and hay against the cold. Harold Brandt had shown most of them how. He was 63 years old in the fall of 1887. A large, deliberate man who moved through the world with the settled authority of someone who had earned every opinion he held and saw no reason to revisit any of them. He had come to Dakota Territory in 1878 from Wisconsin, one of the first to file along the creek, and he had survived 9 winters that had broken younger and stronger men than he had ever been. He had buried his wife Marta in the winter of 1881, when the temperature held at 38 below for 11 straight days, and the snow drifted over the fence posts whole. He had buried his son Robert the following winter of a fever the cold had gotten down into. He was not a cruel man. He had carried water for Eleanor when the pump froze in September. He had lent Thomas Voss his broad axe without being asked twice. When Thomas died, Brandt had been the first one there, and he had dug the grave himself, because the ground was just soft enough, and he was just strong enough, and because it was the thing that ought to be done. But Harold Brandt had opinions about cellars, and he held them the way he held everything, which was to say firmly and without much room left over. Eleanor found him outside the general store on a Tuesday morning in late August, 3 weeks after Thomas's funeral, loading salt and cornmeal into his wagon. She had come to town for flour and a small bag of dried apples, and the particular conversation she had been putting off. "Mr. Brandt," she said, "I would like to ask you about cellar depth." He set a sack of cornmeal in the wagon bed and looked at her with the patient expression of a man who had answered a great many questions in his life and expected to answer a great many more. 3 feet, he said before she had finished asking. 3 feet with good banking and the right insulation. Same as everyone. And if the frost goes deeper than 3 feet, it does not. Not with proper banking. It did in Iowa in 73 and in 62. Brant shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head at a question he considers already settled. This is not Iowa. The snow lies differently here. The earth holds differently. A proper cellar with good hay banking on the outside walls will keep your stores at 38 degrees through the coldest weeks the territory has to offer. And if you are wrong, he looked at her, then really looked the way men looked at women who pushed past the first answer and kept on going. I have 9 winters in this territory, Mrs. Voss. I have buried a wife and a son. I have kept stores through weather that killed cattle, standing upright in the fields. He picked up another sack. I am not wrong about this. How much would a deeper cellar cost in materials alone? If a person wanted to go to, say, 12 feet or 15, Brant set the sack down on the tailgate and turned to face her fully. And his voice when he spoke had the careful slowness of a man trying to be kind about something he found foolish. Mrs. Voss, you have $40. You have a half-built cabin with no floor and no roof. You have 4 months before the hard freeze in a woodpile that would not see you through a mild December. You have 2 mules, no help, no husband, and no family within 700 miles. He paused, letting it land. You cannot dig a deep cellar. You cannot afford the timber to frame it. You cannot do the labor alone, not at your age, not in the time you have. And even if by some miracle you could, you would spend everything you have on a hole in the ground and have nothing left for the roof or the wood, and you would freeze in that cabin long before the cellar ever did you any good. Dig 3 feet. Bank it well. Pray the winter is merciful. That is the only advice I have, and it is good advice. He said the word widow without saying it. It was in the whole speech, underneath every line of it, the assumption that her aloneness was a kind of diagnosis that it explained in advance everything she could and could not do. Eleanor listened to all of it. Thank you for your time, she said. She bought 12 pounds of flour, 5 pounds of salt, and a small bag of dried apples. The total came to $6.20, which left her with $36.80, a 3-foot hole, and the memory of flat creek stones in a dead boy's coat pockets. She went home and began to dig. What Harold Brant did not know, what Eleanor had told no one because the knowledge had never had an audience that wanted it, was that she had been thinking about cellar depth for the better part of her life. She had read everything she could find on the subject. She had talked to old farmers in Minnesota who remembered the winter of '56 and the winter of '73. She had pressed her father in the years before he died for every detail he could dredge up about those 2 February mornings. The depth of the frost line, the direction of the wind, what might conceivably have saved them. She had measured cellars at every farm she had ever visited, compared notes with women who had lost their stores, and women who had not set their losses against depth and banking and soil and the lay of the land. And slowly over decades she had arrived at an understanding that the men around her, in their certainty, had never bothered to reach. The earth below a certain depth held a nearly constant temperature, regardless of what the air above it did. In the clay plains of Dakota Territory, that temperature ran somewhere between 48 and 55 degrees at depth, too warm for long storage on its own, but blessedly stable. The trick was not to rely on the Earth's natural temperature. The trick was to use the depth of the Earth as insulation against the surface swings, and then to manage the cellar's temperature actively to draw cold night air down through ventilation when the surface dropped below 40, bringing the chamber to that narrow saving band of 38 to 40 degrees that kept root vegetables firm without freezing them, and then to seal the vents at dawn and let the earth hold that cold against the day. It wasn't complicated once you understood that cold air was heavier than warm and would sink and pool at the bottom of an enclosed space if you let it. But it required depth. Below 12 feet, the Earth's buffer was deep enough to prevent the catastrophic swings that destroyed shallow cellars. 12 was the minimum. She wanted 15 because she had learned in Iowa exactly what the cost of being a few feet short could be. She understood what 15 feet meant. It meant 6 weeks of brutal labor in clay that turned to packed concrete below 4 feet. It meant timber she could not afford. It meant time she did not have for the cabin roof and the woodpile. It meant doing the one thing that every experienced settler in Beaver Creek would swear up and down was impossible. She drove the shovel into the earth and began. The first 4 feet went quickly. The prairie topsoil was loose from the summer rains, and Eleanor could move roughly 2 inches of depth in an hour if she paced herself, resting every half hour, eating twice a day, drinking water, whether she was thirsty or not, the way her father had taught her to work hard ground. She rigged a rope and bucket on the second day to haul the spoil up out of the hole and spread it along the creek bank where it would not drift back in. Clara Whitmore came on the third day. Clara was 42, the mother of 6 children ranging from 4 to 17, the wife of a man named George, who farmed well enough but whose chest had been weak since a bout of pneumonia 3 winters back. She was practical in the way that frontier women learn to be practical not by temperament but by necessity, by years of making cold calculations about what was possible and what would simply kill you if you were fool enough to try it. She stood at the edge of the expanding pit and watched Eleanor work for a while before she said anything. "What exactly are you doing down there?" Eleanor climbed out, wiping clay from her hands on her apron. "Digging a cellar." "That is not a cellar. A cellar is 3 feet. That is something else entirely." Clara peered down into the hole. "You are past 5 feet already. Nobody digs 5 feet. I am going to 15. Clara's face moved through several expressions in quick succession. Surprise, then concern, then a kind of steady focus that meant she was taking the statement seriously, rather than waving it off. "Eleanor, that is not possible. You will hit the water table. The walls will slump and bury you before you ever get them framed. And even if they hold, how do you fetch stores out in January? You will break your neck on an iced ladder." "I will build the ladder properly. And the water table is lower than 15 feet here. I checked the well logs at the land office." "You will run out of time is what you will do. The ground freezes in 6 weeks. You still have no roof on that cabin." Clara glanced up at the canvas stretched over the bare rafters, then back down at the woman standing in the half-dug pit. "You cannot do everything, Eleanor. No one could. Then I will do this first." "Why this?" Eleanor drove the shovel into the clay at the bottom of the hole. "Because the roof will not matter if I starve." Clara was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had softened, lost some of its briskness. "I know you have had a hard season. Thomas passing the way he did so sudden, and now you out here alone with all of this. I am not grieving my way into a bad decision." Eleanor said without looking up. I am making a calculation. What calculation? The frost went 4 feet in Iowa twice in my lifetime. It will go that deep here in a bad year or deeper. A 3-foot cellar will freeze in a bad year. A 15-foot cellar will not. She levered a load of clay into the bucket. That is the whole of the calculation. There is no grief in it. Clara stood watching a little longer. Then she left without another word, and Eleanor heard her wagon roll off down the track, and she kept digging until the light failed. At 4 feet the soil changed. The loose topsoil gave way to dense, packed clay, a different material altogether, hard as old oak, demanding a different method. Eleanor switched from the straight-blade shovel to a pick for the breaking, and used the shovel only to scoop the loosened clay into the bucket. It was slower and far more punishing. The shock of the pick striking hard clay traveled up the handle into her wrists, her elbows, her shoulders, until her whole upper body felt as though it had been worked over with a club. Her palms blistered, tore and blistered again over the torn skin. She rested more. She ate carefully, never too much and never too little. She slept harder than she had slept since before Thomas died. At 6 feet, the temperature changed. She noticed it first on the 6th morning climbing down the ladder to start the day's work. The air at the bottom of the pit was distinctly cooler than the air above. Not cold, but different, settled still. The October sun still warmed the surface, and she could feel its heat on her back while she worked. But down at the bottom there was a dampness, a steadiness, a sense of the earth breathing at some slower rate of its own. She pressed her palm flat against the clay wall. It felt like the inside of a spring house. Cool, constant, indifferent to the season. This was what she had been digging toward. Edmund Hollis ran the lumber operation 2 miles north of Beaver Creek, out of a sawmill he had built in 1882, on the strength of a government contract that had since expired. He was a heavy-set man in his middle 50s, deliberate in manner with a reputation for fair prices and absolutely inflexible terms. He had extended credit to 3 families in the early years who had not survived their first winters, and he had spent every year since not extending credit to anyone for any reason. Eleanor found him on a Thursday afternoon in late September, supervising the cutting of winter stock at the mill. 15 feet. He repeated when she had explained what she needed. His voice was neither unkind nor interested. You want to frame a root cellar 15 feet deep. I need 8 posts, 6 by 6, 12 feet long, and planking for the wall liners and the roof frame. Hollis looked at her with the steady patience of a man running a business. The posts alone would run you $18. The planking on top of that. You have $18, I have 7. Then you have a problem, Mrs. Voss, and it is not one I can solve. I can work. I can cook clean, do your laundry and your mending, anything that needs doing until spring. Hollis shook his head, not unkindly, but with the flat finality of a door closing. I do not need a cook. I do not need a maid. What I need is paying customers, and what you need is to stop digging a hole that is gonna collapse and bury you. He turned back toward the screaming saw. Go home, Mrs. Voss. Dig a proper 3-foot cellar bank well, and pray the winter is easy. Eleanor walked back to her claim in the failing light, running numbers she already knew by heart. $7. 18 needed. $11 short with no family to wire, no credit to draw, and no way under the sun to close the gap before the ground turned to iron. She sat that night at the edge of the 8-foot hole and watched the stars wheel over the dark prairie. And for the first time since Thomas died, she felt the precise weight of being alone. It was not loneliness. She had made her peace with loneliness long before she ever came west. It was something more exact than loneliness, the simple recognition that every resource has a limit, and that she had finally found hers. Will did not dig clay. Memory did not buy timber. She had been right about the depth, and being right was not going to be enough. And that was a harder thing to sit with than she had expected. She went into the cabin and took a sheet of paper and sat by the lantern and began a letter to her sister Ruth, who had stayed in Iowa. "Dear Ruth," she wrote in the unsteady hand of a tired woman writing late, "I may have been wrong about everything. I believed I had planned sufficiently. I believed the calculation was correct, and I still believe it is. But a correct calculation requires materials, and materials require money. And I have neither the money nor anyone in this whole country willing to lend it to me." She stopped there. She read the sentence back. She looked at it for a long time in the lantern light. Then she folded the paper carefully into quarters and put it in the pocket of her dress. She took the lantern down into the 8-foot hole and picked up the shovel and kept digging because the only alternative was to stop. And stopping meant the 3-foot cellar. And the 3-foot cellar meant the frost. And the frost meant flat stones cold in a coat pocket and a father's spread fingers pressing warmth into a boy who had none left. And that was the one memory, the one truth she had carried for a quarter of her life, that she was not willing to carry forward one winter more. Callan Morse arrived on a Sunday morning in early October, leading a mule that had seen better decades. He was 17 years old, thin as a fence rail, with hands that had been worked and calloused well past what his years suggested. He had pale, steady eyes that looked directly at things without the sliding evasiveness that uncertainty so often gives to young men. And he wore his father's coat, which sat too broad across his shoulders, in a way that made him look younger than he was rather than older. He stood at the edge of the pit 8 feet deep, now Eleanor laboring at the bottom, and looked down into it. "Mrs. Voss," he said. She looked up. "Who are you?" "Callan Morse. My father was James Morse. He had the quarter section east of the Bergmans." He paused. "He died last winter. Pneumonia." Eleanor set the shovel against the wall. "I am sorry to hear it. My mother took the younger ones back to Wisconsin in the spring. I stayed on working where I could, saving toward a claim of my own." He looked into the hole with an expression she could not quite read. "Mrs. Whitmore told me what you were doing out here." "Did she?" "She said you were trying to dig to China, and that you were going to kill yourself doing it." He glanced at her, and something almost like the beginning of a smile touched the corner of his mouth and went away again. She said it like it was a criticism. I did not take it that way. Eleanor climbed the ladder out of the pit. She studied him a moment in the cool morning light. The calloused hands, the steady eyes, the coat. "Why did you come?" she said. The boy was quiet for a moment, choosing. "My father dug a 3-foot cellar," he said finally. "Same as everybody. Last winter we lost half our potatoes to the frost. He said it was bad luck." Callan looked down into the hole again. I thought it was bad planning. He died before I could ever say so. He drew a breath. My father had lumber set aside. From before he took sick, he had it in his mind to frame a new cellar. That summer, dig it proper. 6 posts oak, he cut them himself, about 10 feet each, and some pine planking warped in places but sound. It has been sitting at the old place since spring doing nothing. He stopped. Nobody is using it. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a loosening the way a hard knot gives all at once when you finally find the right end to pull. What do you want for it? She said. Callan met her eyes and held them. A place to sleep through the winter, and a share of whatever that cellar keeps. The frontier stripped the pretense out of bargains and left only the bare arithmetic of survival. And in that arithmetic, this one was clean and simple, a boy with his dead father's lumber, and nowhere in the world to go, and a woman with a hole that needed framing and no earthly way to frame it. The need on both sides was real. The terms were fair. You help me dig, Eleanor said. You help me frame it, you help me finish the cabin roof and stack the wood, and you can stay until spring. Callan Morse held out his hand. She shook it. They went back to the hole together. The lumber came by mule cart 3 days later, Callan driving and the oak posts riding athwart the bed with their cut ends hanging off both sides. Eleanor watched him unload them one at a time, stacking them neatly along the lip of the pit, with the care of a person handling something that meant more than its weight. When the last post was down, he stood beside the stack a moment longer than the work required. Your father cut these himself, Eleanor said. That summer. Said he would frame a proper cellar and get the depth right next time. Callan looked at the posts without expression. He did not get to it. Eleanor said nothing. There was nothing useful to say, and she had learned long ago not to fill that kind of silence with words for her own comfort. The planking is warped, some of it, Callan added, turning back toward the cart. The sound pieces have chalk marks on them. He did that. I never knew why. He knew the difference between the good and the bad, Eleanor said. He was sorting it for the job he meant to do. Callan looked at her for a moment. Then he bent and began unloading the planking. And the chalk marks were pale gray ghosts on the gray wood. And neither of them said anything more about James Morse that day. With 2 of them working, the whole character of the labor changed. Callan was stronger than Eleanor had expected. Not merely young man strong, but work strong. The deep, durable strength that comes from sustained labor over years, rather than the showy kind that fades by noon. He had his father's economy with a pick, a short, efficient swing that broke the clay clean without wasting an ounce of motion. Eleanor directed and Callan executed, and between them they drove the pit downward at very nearly twice the pace she had managed alone. She taught him the bucket rig. She taught him to cut the clay walls dead vertical, rather than sloped so the pressure of the surrounding earth pressed the wall into itself and worked in their favor, instead of slumping inward. She taught him to read the soil, the shifts in color and density that told you when you were passing from one layer to the next, the dark horizontal stains where underground water had stood a very long time ago and left its memory in the clay. At 9 feet, they struck one of those stains, a band of darkened earth, running level across all 4 walls. Water, Callan said, touching it. Old water. Eleanor said. The table is lower than this now. This is where water sat a long time back, maybe 100 years, maybe more. The clay remembers it. She pressed her finger into the stain. It held firm, dry, solid. It is not seeping. We are fine. Keep on. How do you know all this? Because I read everything I could lay hands on, and I asked everyone who had ever lost stores and everyone who had not. And over 30 years I worked out where the difference lay. She looked up at him from the bottom of the hole. The difference is almost always depth. Men want it to be luck because luck is nobody's fault. It is not luck. It is depth. Callan worked the pick a while in silence. My father said it was bad luck, he said at last. When we lost the potatoes. He said the frost ran deep that year. It was just bad luck. Was it? The boy thought about it honestly. The way she was coming to understand, he thought about most things. No, he said finally. It was a 3-foot cellar in a country that never promised 3 feet would be enough. Eleanor picked up her shovel and said nothing because he had said it better than she could have, and there was no improving on it. At 10 feet, the temperature differential was beyond mistaking. The surface air had turned hard and cold by mid-October, dropping near freezing on clear nights. But the air at the bottom of the pit hung motionless and cool, somewhere in the upper 40s by her reckoning. She laid her bare palm against the clay and felt the earth's deep, ancient steadiness under her hand. The steadiness that had nothing to do with weather or season, that had been there before the prairie had a name. 50 degrees, she said. Maybe 52. Too warm for potatoes, Callan said. He had the numbers by heart. Now 38 to 40 was the window, 8 degrees standing between firm food and ruin. Too warm as it stands. That is what the vents are for. She pointed up toward where the entrance would be cut. We build 2 vents into the roof frame. One near the door, one at the far corner. Wooden pipes with covers that slide. On clear, cold nights, when the surface drops below 40, we open them both. Cold air is heavier than warm, Callan. It does not rise. It sinks. It pours down into the cellar and fills it from the floor up like water filling a jar. And come morning, most men do not. They dig a hole and they hope. Hope is not a plan, he said. No, Eleanor said. It is not. It is what you are left with when you did not make one. Edmund Hollis came in the 3rd week of October. Eleanor was at the bottom of the pit when she heard his voice up at the surface, that deliberate, businesslike tone she remembered from the sawmill. She climbed the ladder to find him standing at the edge, with a lantern peering down into the shaft, with an expression she could not immediately read. 14 feet, he said as her head cleared the lip. 15 by the end of the week. Hollis said nothing for a moment. He held the lantern out over the void, and the light fell down the clay walls and caught the framing they had set at the corners. Callan's oak posts braced with cross members at 4-foot intervals. The pine planking nailed to the inside of the walls, wherever the clay showed any inclination to slump. It was not elegant work. It was sound work, which on the frontier was the only kind that counted for anything. He studied it a long time the way a man studies the work of someone he has underestimated. The framing is decent, he said finally. There was something grudging in it and something else underneath the grudge. The posts are oak. Callan's father cut them. Hollis nodded. He looked at the framing and at Eleanor, and back down into the hole. Then he said flatly, the way he said everything, "You know the ground freezes in 2 weeks. You have not finished your cabin. You have not stacked enough wood. You have poured 6 weeks into a hole in the ground. The arithmetic does not work, Mrs. Voss. One way or another, something fails. Most likely all of it." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Then I will fail above ground," she said, "not below it." Hollis held her gaze for a long moment, and something moved behind his face that was not quite respect, and was not quite anything she had a single word for the look of a man quietly revising a position he had been entirely certain of an hour before. He turned and walked away without another word, and she heard his horse, and then she heard nothing. The next morning, 4 oak posts were stacked beside the pit. No note, no invoice, no explanation of any kind. Eleanor stood over them a while in the cold morning light, and then she looked off down the empty road toward the sawmill that could not be seen from where she stood, and she said, to no one, and she carried the nearest post over to the framing and set it in place. They hit 15 feet on the 29th of October. Eleanor stood at the bottom of the shaft and looked up the long throat of it at the small, distant circle of October sky, gray, cold, impossibly far. The floor underfoot was packed harder than anything they had cut through above, and the air around her hung cool and motionless and smelled of deep earth, a smell that had nothing whatever to do with the surface, or the weather, or the turning of the year. It was the smell of the earth's own held temperature, the one it kept faithfully, no matter what went on overhead. She pressed her palm flat to the wall. Cool, constant, ready. "We made it," Callan said. "We made it to the depth," Eleanor said. "Now we make it a cellar. That is the harder half." The framing took 4 days of brutal labor. They set the corner posts first, sinking them 2 feet into the packed cellar floor and bracing them against the clay with iron spikes Eleanor had salvaged from Thomas's abandoned toolbox. Crossbeams came next, rough oak, spanning the 15-foot square building, the skeleton that would carry the roof. Callan's posts and the 4 from Hollis combined with cottonwood logs they cut from the creek bank and stripped and wedged into place with prairie sod gave them just barely enough. Just barely enough was all the frontier had ever once offered her. The roof was the piece that mattered most, and Eleanor had been turning its design over in her mind since August. Too heavy and the framing would buckle and bring the whole thing down. Too light, and it would not hold the weight of banking soil that had to insulate the chamber through the winter. She had settled on a design worked out over several evenings on the back of a seed catalog. A double layer of cottonwood planks, separated by a foot of packed prairie sod. Then a second layer of planks, then a final capping layer of sod. When they finished it on the 7th of November, the roof weighed well over 1,000 pounds. It sagged a little in the center. It held. The trap door was a problem they solved with desperation. A hatch cut into the roof frame built up from scrap hung on leather hinges cut from an old harness. It was not elegant. Lifting it from below took both hands in a particular upward heave, and Eleanor practiced the motion in the dark until it was automatic, because she could imagine more than one circumstance in which she would need to open that door fast and could not afford to fumble it. The ventilation pipes came last. They drilled 2 holes through the roof frame with a brace and bit that had been Thomas's, fitted each with a square pipe built up from cedar shingles, and mounted sliding covers worked from inside the cellar. Eleanor tested them 3 times. They moved freely. They sealed tight. On the 15th of November, she climbed down the ladder with a candle and a thermometer she had borrowed from Mr. Addison, the schoolteacher, who had lent it with the slightly amused air of a man humoring an eccentric neighbor. She held the thermometer steady in the still air at the bottom and waited for the mercury to settle. 48 degrees. Too warm, exactly as she had expected. The vents had stayed sealed all through the building, and the earth had been quietly bleeding its stored summer heat into the closed chamber. That night she opened both vents wide and left them gaping until dawn. In the morning, 41 degrees. Better. Not yet perfect, but potatoes would keep at 41 if the humidity held steady. She worked the vents for the next several nights, thrown open at dusk, sealed hard at first light, and by the time the cellar was ready to fill, the thermometer read 39 degrees on the clear, cold mornings. They filled it over 2 days at the end of November. 12 bushels of potatoes went into slatted wooden bins along the north wall. Each bin lifted off the floor on wooden pallets so the air could move beneath them. Eleanor inspected every potato before it went in, setting aside any with a soft spot or a cut, keeping only the sound ones because one rotting potato in a clothes bin would take a dozen good ones down with it. 8 bushels of turnips took the east wall. 6 bushels of carrots went into boxes packed with dry straw roots pointed downward so they would not sprout. The cabbages, 3 bushels of them, she wrapped at the stem in damp burlap and hung from the roof frame on ropes, heads down, the way her mother had hung them in the cellar in Iowa a lifetime ago. 37 jars of plum preserves put up from the wild trees along the creek through the late summer went along the southwest wall, kept well clear of the vegetables. Callan set the last crate and stepped back. The cellar smelled of earth and straw and root vegetables and cedar, and underneath all of it some other quality of the air that Eleanor recognized but could not have named the smell, perhaps, of a thing that had been done right. "Will it work?" he said. Eleanor was watching the thermometer. As she watched, the mercury settled at 39 degrees. "Ask me in January," she said. There was still the cabin. She had known from the first day she chose the cellar over the roof that she was wagering against the natural order of things. A person who starved had no use for a warm cabin, but a person who froze to death had no use for a full cellar either. She had placed her chips on the cellar first, and now she had to play the rest of the hand with whatever was left. And what was left was a fortnight of failing weather and 2 pairs of hands. Callan worked the cabin roof while Eleanor split wood. The canvas came down, and cottonwood planks went up over the bare rafters, close-fitted and caulked with moss and dried grass, wherever they did not sit flush. Over the planks went sod-thick slabs of prairie sod, lay grass side down, and built up until the roof was 1.5 feet deep and solid enough to walk on. It was not a handsome roof. It was a weatherproof one, which was a different thing and a far more important one. They banked the cabin walls with earth 3 feet up the outside and packed the gaps with hay and dried grass and the drifted leaves that had collected against the north wall. Eleanor set the small glass window she had bought in August into the south wall to catch what little the winter sun would offer. The woodpile stood at 5 cords when the first hard frost whitened the prairie. She had wanted 8. 8 was the safe number, the number that carried 2 people to April without rationing the fire. 5 was not safe. 5 was merely possible if the winter was not the worst kind, if they tended the stove with discipline, if the deep January cold broke before February had a chance to finish what it started. Harold Brandt came to look at the cellar in the first week of December. He came alone mid-morning without bringing anything or inventing a reason, which was itself a kind of statement. He walked to the trap door in the yard, looked at it, looked at Eleanor and said, "I want to see it." She said nothing. She lifted the door and held it open. Brandt went down the ladder with the careful, sideways movements of a man minding a bad knee. He stood at the bottom of the shaft a long while, and Eleanor came down after him and stood off to one side and let him look his fill. He tested the wall framing with both broad hands. He examined the ventilation pipes working the sliding cover back and forth. He studied the stores, the bins of firm potatoes, the straw-packed carrots, the cabbages swinging gently from their ropes. He looked at the thermometer, 38 degrees. He was a long time quiet. "It is well built," he said finally, and the words came out of him slowly, the way a man pays a debt he had not expected to owe. "Better than I would have said a soul could manage out here alone. I will give you that." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "But you have poured 6 weeks into this that should have gone to wood." He moved toward the ladder. 5 cords is not enough, and you know it is not. If the cold sets in hard come January and does not break until March, 5 cords does not see you through. You will have the fullest cellar in Beaver Creek and freeze to death in the cabin above it. "If the cold sets in hard come January," Eleanor said, "and folk with 3-foot cellars lose their stores, then they will need food. And I will have food to give. And perhaps in the trade of it, someone will see fit to help me with the wood." Brandt paused on the ladder halfway up, his bad knee bent under him. He did not look back down at her. "That is a gamble," he said. "Most things are Mr. Brandt," Eleanor said. "You gambled 3 feet would hold for 9 winters, and it did. I am gambling it will not hold for a 10th. He went up and out without answering that, and she heard his footsteps cross the frozen yard, and after a moment the sound of his horse moving off down the road. She stood at the bottom of the cellar a while longer alone with the thermometer and the potatoes, and the slow swinging cabbages and the smell of deep earth. And she thought about Henry and her father's spread fingers in the folded letter still in her pocket that she had never sent. Then she climbed the ladder and went out to help Callan with the wood, because the wood was the gamble's other half, and gambles were won by the people who did the work before the dice were thrown. December was cold but workable. The temperatures dropped to 12 below on the worst nights and climbed back to single digits by day, with enough clear stretches to cut and split and haul. By Christmas, they had added 1.5 cords to the pile. Not enough. Better than it had been. She checked the cellar every single morning. The thermometer never rose above 42, nor sank below 36. The potatoes stayed firm. The carrots stayed crisp. The cabbages showed not the faintest softening. In the 3-foot and 4-foot cellars of Beaver Creek, the properly built, expertly banked, sensible cellars that Harold Brandt had been recommending for a decade, things had begun quietly to go wrong. Clara Whitmore mentioned at the store that her cellar floor had felt cold enough to worry her. Otto Bergman, whose farm sat in a low draw where the wind stripped the snow away thin, said he had found ice crystals forming on the outsides of his carrot boxes. Eleanor said nothing to any of it. She checked her thermometer. She worked her vents. She watched the weather. January the 11th, 1888. The morning came in at 34 degrees above zero, warm for January. Warm enough that several families in Beaver Creek took it for an outright gift. Children walked to school without their heavy coats. Farmers stepped out to see to their stock without wrapping their faces against the air. The sky was soft and low and gray and utterly still. And if you had not grown up in an Iowa farmhouse listening to your father talk about weather breeders and wolves that smile before they bit it, would have felt like nothing in the world but a mercy. Eleanor stood in the cabin doorway at first light and felt it. Not a temperature, not a sound. A quality in the air. A particular pressing stillness different in kind. From ordinary winter stillness, a change in pressure she felt in her sinuses and at the base of her skull like a held breath. The sky away to the northwest was a color she had seen exactly once before in Iowa, when she was a girl. A gray that was nearly purple at its lowest edge. A gray that was thinking hard about becoming something else. She went straight to the cellar and climbed down. 38 degrees. Both vents sealed from the night before. She checked them anyway. She checked the latch on the trap door, and then she checked it again. Back in the cabin, she lifted the thermometer off its nail and read it 34 above. "Callan," she said. He was at the table over his breakfast. He looked up. "Bring the mules inside." He stared at her. "Inside the cabin. Move the table to the corner. They will fit, if you make them fit. Mrs. Voss, they weigh near 1,000 pounds apiece. And then fill every pot we own with water. Every pot, every pail, every jar that is not holding food. Do it now." Callan set down his spoon. He looked at her face for a moment, and he had known her 3 months by then, had labored beside her in the hole and on the roof, and at the woodpile had watched her make 100 decisions, and had seen her tired, and had seen her wrong, and had seen her right, far more often than wrong. He had learned to read her face the way she had taught him to read the soil for what lay underneath the surface of it. And what he saw in her face now was something he had not seen there before. It was not fear. Eleanor Voss's face did not do fear the way most faces did. It was the look of a person recognizing something she had met once before, long ago, in circumstances she had spent the rest of her life refusing to forget. He pushed back his chair, and he went to get the mules. The storm came at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, not gradually, not with any warning beyond the one Eleanor had already read in the color of the sky. One moment the day was gray and still and soft, with that false January warmth. The next, the northwestern sky had gone black, and the wind struck the cabin wall like a solid thing thrown against it, 60 miles an hour off the northwest, carrying snow so fine and dense that it turned the world white and killed all visibility within seconds of the door. A man could have lost his cabin from 10 feet away. Eleanor had the door barred before the temperature began to fall. She had made her last circuit of the place at noon, checked the cellar latch, heaped extra sod against the north wall, made certain the woodpile could be reached from the door without crossing. Open ground that would drift. She had done everything a person could think to do, and now there was nothing left but to feed the fire and wait it out. The thermometer on the cabin wall stood at 32 degrees when the wind hit. Within the first hour it had fallen to 22, then to 9, then to 6 below. The mules stood crowded into the corner where the table had been, eyes rolling white, stamping at the packed earth floor. Callan fed the stove cottonwood as fast as he dared, hot enough to push back against the cold, bleeding through the chinking careful, not to burn through their margin too quickly. Eleanor melted snow in the pots she had filled, hedging against the water barrel freezing, which it did on the second night, despite sitting an arm's length from the stove. 18 below, then 24, then 31 below zero, a reading the thermometer held for 6 straight hours through the middle of the second night, while the wind shook the heavy sod roof and tested the banking and probed every gap in the chinking for a way inside. Eleanor did not sleep. She sat by the stove and fed it, and kept one part of her mind always on the figures, the wall thermometer, the wood remaining by the door, the hours yet to dawn, and another part of it 15 feet down, on the chamber of cool, still earth between her food and all this killing cold. 15 feet was a great deal of earth. She told herself that through the long middle of the night more than once. "How long can it last?" Callan asked her somewhere in the dark of the second night. She did not answer at once. She was watching the mercury. It had stopped its fall. It sat at 31 below and held there, as though the cold itself had finally reached the bottom of what it had to give. "However long it lasts," she said, "is however long it lasts. There is no use measuring it. Feed the fire." He fed the fire. The storm lasted 3 days. When the wind finally stopped, the silence was the worst of it. She had grown so used to the noise, 3 days of it. A constant roar that shifted pitch, but never ceased, broken by the crack of frozen timber contracting and the deep, soft thud of snow sliding off the roof, that it had become a kind of pressure. She had stopped consciously hearing the way you stop, feeling the weight of your own coat. When it ended, the pressure released all at once, and the silence that flooded in to replace it felt enormous and brittle and very, very cold. She waited a full hour before she touched the door bar. It was the kind of caution that kept people alive out here. The storm pretending to end the lull that was only the wind drawing breath for another run at you. But the hour of silence held, and then a second hour, and the pale light through the south window had the clean, still quality of morning after a clear night. She lifted the bar and pushed the door. It moved 6 inches and stopped against wind-packed snow that had curled around the southern corner of the cabin. She put her shoulder to it and forced it to the width of her body and squeezed out sideways into the open. The prairie was gone. In its place lay a hard, unbroken sheet of white that took the early light and threw it back without 1 degree of warmth in it. The woodpile 6 feet from the door was a smooth mound. The fence posts along the east line were buried to their caps. The sky overhead was the pale, depthless blue of extreme cold, cloudless, empty. The sun hung in it as a bright and wholly irrelevant disk. The thermometer on the outer wall read 27 below. Callan squeezed out the door behind her and stood a moment taking it in. "Lord," he said quietly. "Find the cellar door," Eleanor said. The trap door lay under 4 feet of drifted snow, packed by the wind to a density that was very nearly ice. They dug toward it from the cabin along the path Eleanor had memorized working with the grain scoop and the coal shovel. And it took 2 full hours, not for any slowness in them, but because every shovelful was a shovelful of resistance, the drift fighting back against each cut of the blade. Callan's breath came in hard white plumes. The old deep ache settled into Eleanor's shoulders like an acquaintance returning. The trap door appeared at last as a dark rectangle in all that white. The leather hinges crusted thick and frozen. Callan went back for the kettle and poured the still hot water along the hinges, working from one end to the other, and they watched the ice let go in a slow gray seep down the wood. Eleanor knelt in the snow and pulled the door open. The cold air above and the different air below met in one brief, visible breath of condensation between them. She lit the candle she had carried in her coat, sheltered the flame in the curve of her hand, and went down the ladder. The rungs were cold but not iced. The clay walls around her were exactly as she had left them 6 weeks before, same color, same texture, same solidity. And she could tell before her boot ever touched the floor that the air down here was a different country from the air above. It was cool and still and held none of the murderous bite of the surface. It smelled of earth and straw and cedar. She raised the candle to the thermometer. 37 degrees Fahrenheit. She stood still a moment. Then she crossed to the potato bins along the north wall and pressed her thumb against the nearest one. Firm. She lifted another into the candlelight and turned it over in her fingers. No soft spot, no glassy skin. No sign anywhere that the frost had reached in and touched it. She went to the carrot boxes, pulled one free of its straw, bent it gently. It held without cracking the sure sign of a carrot that had never frozen and thawed. The cabbages hung from the roof frame, motionless, unchanged, exactly as on the day she had tied them. The frost had not come down here. 15 feet of Dakota earth had held it out. Eleanor Voss sat down on the overturned crate in the southwest corner, and she put her worn hands in her lap, and she cried. It was not the quiet, contained crying of a woman keeping her composure. It was the other kind, the kind that had been stored up for 15 years inside one specific memory, and that now, at 37 degrees at the bottom of a hole, she had dug with her own 2 hands, finally had somewhere it was allowed to go. She cried for Henry, and for her father's spread fingers, pressing warmth into a body that had none. She cried for the letter folded in her pocket, and never sent for the doubt she had carried down into this hole and was leaving here. She cried because every calculation she had made and every choice she had defended against every voice in the county had been correct, and the thing she had feared most, the cold engine that had driven all of it, had come exactly as she feared, and had been turned away. Up at the surface, the frost had gone deeper than anyone in Beaver Creek had planned for. Down here, the earth held 37 degrees, and the potatoes were firm. Callan stood at the top of the ladder looking down into the candlelit dark. He did not climb in. He understood without being told that this was not his moment to be in. The news from the settlement came in over the days that followed, carried back by Callan on the 3rd day after the wind died, when the temperature had climbed to 15 below, and the road was passable for a man who dressed for it and kept moving. He was gone 2 hours, and Eleanor knew from his face before he spoke a word that what he carried was not good. Clara Whitmore's cellar had frozen to the floor. She had gone in on the 2nd morning of the storm reckless, but the children had to eat and found the boards white with ice and the potato bins frozen through. She had moved what she could up onto the higher shelves, which ran a degree or 2 warmer, and lost 2 bushels before she got them lifted. The rest had survived, but she had spent the storm hunched over her stove, counting what was left against the weeks still standing between her family and the spring. Otto Bergman was worse. Bergman farmed a low draw along the south drainage, a place the wind scoured thin every winter, leaving the frost a clear, uninsulated road down into the ground. His cellar was 4 feet deep, deeper than most dug, after he had lost a part of his stores in '84, and taken from it the lesson to go 1 foot further. He had trusted that lesson the way a man trusts a thing that worked once. On the second day of the storm, desperate to fetch food up for his 3 grandchildren, wintering with him while his son worked the railroad, he had opened his cellar and found not cold but solid ice. Floor to ceiling, the whole chamber frozen into a single block. He had slipped, climbing back out. The ice ladder gave under him and he went down hard onto the frozen ground beside the door and broke his hip. And his son had found him there the next morning when the storm broke alive. But barely the cold gone deep into him. They had him at the cabin now, and his daughter-in-law was doing what could be done. But the doctor was in Yankton, and in that weather Yankton might as well have been the moon. And Harold Brandt's cellar 4 feet deep, properly banked, expertly built. The very model he had been preaching for 10 years had held through the cold of December and early January, and then failed in the blizzard's wake. The frost that followed the 3 days of wind with the insulating snow stripped clean off the ground around his cellar entrance had gone down to 4.5 feet, and in the worst exposed places very likely to 5. It had entered his potato bins from the bottom. He had gone in the morning the wind died and found the lower half of every bin frozen 4 inches into the potatoes, and he was working through them. Now Callan had seen him through the window as he passed, sitting at his kitchen table with a lamp and a paring knife, sorting each potato by hand, the frozen from the sound trying to reckon how long his family could live on what was left. Callan told it all in the flat, steady voice of a man reporting facts rather than judging them. When he was done, the cabin was quiet a while. "How many lost their stores, do you think?" Eleanor asked. "Most everyone? Anyone with a cellar under 6 feet? That is everyone but you." Eleanor looked down at her hands. "And the Bergman grandchildren," she said. "What are they eating? Whatever Otto had above ground. Salt pork and flour. The daughter-in-law's been baking what she can." Eleanor stood up. "Go back," she said. "Tell them all to come here." Harold Brandt came alone without the grandchildren on the morning of January the 15th. She saw him from the window. A large, deliberate figure laboring up the snow-packed path from the road, moving slower than was usual for him, favoring the left knee badly. He was not wearing his hat. He carried it in his hand at his side. And that one detail, the hat already in his hand before he had reached the door, told her most of what she needed to know about the conversation they were about to have. She opened the door as he reached the yard. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her, and then he looked past her at the trap door rising out of the snow. "I want to see it," he said. She stepped aside, and she lifted the door for him and held it, while he got himself down the ladder, the bad knee making an awkward business of the descent, his breath clouding in the cold air of the shaft. She came down after him and stood off to the side. He stood at the bottom of the 15-foot shaft and looked at everything with the same methodical attention he had given it in December. The framing, the vents, the walls, the stores. But his face was a different face now. Some certainty had gone out of it that had been there before, and the absence of it changed everything about how he held himself. He lifted a potato from the nearest bin. He held it in his hand a moment. He set it back. He looked at the thermometer. 38 degrees. The silence ran a long time. "I told you 3 feet was enough," he said at last, and his voice carried a quality she had never once heard in it. Not loudness, not authority, but a careful, deliberate steadiness. The voice of a man choosing each word as though it cost him something to spend. "I told you the frost never went down so far as this. You told me a good many things, Mr. Brandt. I have 9 winters in this country." He was not arguing. He was reciting the way a man recites the things he has said so often they have worn smooth and lost their meaning, saying them once more to hear how they sound in the new light. "I survived 81. I survived 82. I have kept stores when younger men buried theirs, and then buried each other." "I know it," Eleanor said. "I have never once doubted that you did. And I told you it was a waste. A widow alone could not dig so deep, could not do the labor, could not buy the timber." He stopped. He looked again at the bins of firm potatoes, the cabbages turning slowly on their ropes, the carrots in their straw. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped low. "My grandchildren, 3 of them. Robert's children, my son Robert that I buried in 82. Their mother passed last spring. They have been with me since April." A pause and the steady voice came apart at the edges of it. "I sorted the bins this morning. What is left feeds us to the 1st of February if we are careful. 10 days past that if we are not." Eleanor said nothing. She waited. "February is not the spring," Brandt said. "No," she said. "It is a long way from the spring." Another silence, longer than the first. She watched him stand in the cellar she had dug against his counsel, among the potatoes that had stayed firm against his certain word. And she watched the last of that certainty go quietly out of him, wherever it had been draining since the morning the wind died. "I came to ask," he said, "whether you might have any to spare. I can pay. I can work it off. I can—" He stopped. His jaw worked once. "I am asking you." Harold Brandt had buried a wife and a son. He had survived 9 Dakota winters and told the plain truth about every one of them, as he understood it. And he had been wrong in the particular way that hard experience sometimes makes a man wrong, not through any ignorance, but through too much faith in the narrow lessons of his own survival, with not enough room left over for the lessons he had not yet had to live. Eleanor thought about Henry. She thought about her father carrying him to the wagon with both arms, fingers spread wide across the narrow back, pressing as though warmth could be pushed into a body that had lost the last of its own. She thought about flat creek stones in a coat pocket, and the March mud that took the boot prints, and the long, silent drive back from the burying ground, with no one in the wagon able to speak. She thought about what it meant to have been right, and what a person ought to do with the being right of it. "Take 2 bushels of potatoes," she said, "and 1 of turnips. No payment, no work. You take them home to those children." Brandt looked at her. "And tell the others," Eleanor went on. "Anyone in Beaver Creek who lost their stores, tell them to come here. I did not dig this cellar for my own survival only." He looked at her a long moment, and the expression on his face was not gratitude. Gratitude was too small and too simple a thing for what was working in it. It was the face of a man revising a premise he had built his whole life on, and feeling the revision happen in him in real time and not turning away from it. He took the nearest sack down off its hook on the wall. He began to fill it. Halfway up the ladder, he stopped. He did not look back down. "You were right," he said, "about all of it." Then he climbed out into the cold, and she heard his slow steps cross the yard, and then the sound of him moving away through the snow. Eleanor stood at the bottom of the cellar a while, 38 degrees. She took the thermometer down and held it, and felt the temperature it recorded. And she understood that there is a particular quiet satisfaction granted to people who have been afraid and have acted on the fear instead of being ruled by it. Not triumph, not vindication, but the plain, settled satisfaction of an accurate forecast, the dreaded thing arriving exactly as dreaded, and the work done long in advance of it turning out to be enough. Clara Whitmore came on the 17th, with her eldest daughter carrying 2 empty flour sacks, and the 2 of them loaded potatoes in the wordless, efficient way of women who had work in front of them and meant to get it done. Clara looked at the thermometer on her way down and again on her way up and said nothing about it either time, but her face said the thing her mouth would not. Otto Bergman's daughter-in-law came for that family, Otto still being unable to stand. Her name was Adeline, 24 years old, worn down to the particular exhaustion of a woman who had been managing too many troubles at once for too long. Eleanor sent her home with potatoes and turnips and 2 of the hanging cabbages and a jar of the plum preserves. Adeline stood in the yard turning the jar over in her hands before she put it in the sack. "He is going to want to thank you," she said, meaning Otto. "Tell him to mend his hip," Eleanor said. "That is thanks enough." Edmund Hollis came on the 23rd with a wagon and a young man from the mill, and they loaded 6 bushels for the families out on the North Road, who had sent word they had nothing left at all. Hollis moved through the cellar with his usual efficiency and said little. At the top of the ladder on his way out, he paused. The potatoes went from 12 bushels down to 8, then to 6, then to 5. 5 bushels would carry 2 people from February to April. On careful rations, the potato being the most forgiving and reliable store the frontier offered, dense and filling in a way the turnip never was. The carrots were barely touched. The cabbages hanging in the cool, still air had come through the winter, so nearly whole that they surprised even Eleanor, who had braced for some loss and found almost none. The cellar had held. Even giving away bushel after bushel what she had put up in October proved more than enough for the 2 of them. In late February, when the worst of the cold had finally cracked, and the air outside had climbed toward a working cold rather than a killing one, Eleanor spent an afternoon sorting the last of the stores and taking honest stock of what remained. She found the letter in her coat pocket while she worked, still folded into its quarters, still unread since the night she had written it, soft now and creased from weeks of being carried. She unfolded it and read it once through in the candlelight. "Dear Ruth, I may have been wrong about everything. I believed I had planned sufficiently. I believed the calculation was correct, and I still believe it is. But a correct calculation requires materials, and materials require money, and I have neither the money nor anyone in this whole country willing to lend it to me." Callan was behind her in the cellar, restacking the bins to close up the gaps the giving away had left. She could hear him working the small, honest sounds of it. She lit the candle she kept on the shelf for the thermometer readings and she held the letter to the flame. The paper caught slowly then, with more conviction, and she held it until the fire reached her fingers and made her let it go, and it finished burning on the packed dirt floor in a small black curl of ash. "What was that?" Callan asked from behind her. "A letter Eleanor said that I never needed to send." She looked at the ash a moment, then swept it aside with the toe of her boot and went back to her sorting. It was not a dramatic gesture, and she had not meant it to be one. It was the private act of a person finishing something that had stood unfinished in her for a very long time. Not the forgetting of the fear which she would carry to the end of her days, but the laying down of the doubt. The fear had been correct. The doubt had been the wrong lesson to take from the fear. Doubt and caution were not the same thing, and she had spent a hard autumn learning to tell them apart in 15 feet of Dakota clay. She had made the calculation, and the calculation had been right, and Henry would have been 42 years old that spring. She did not let herself stay long in that thought. She went back to work. Spring came to Beaver Creek the way it always came to the northern plains, grudgingly in fits and starts. A week of melt, and then a week of cold. The ground softening and hardening and softening again, until mid-April finally committed itself to the thaw. The snow went from the south slopes first, then out of the creek bottom, and the prairie turned slowly from white to brown, and at last towards something that was nearly green. That summer, 4 families in Beaver Creek began digging deeper cellars. Harold Brandt was one of them. He dug in June before the heat baked the clay past working. He took it to 9 feet he had spoken of. 12 had told Eleanor he was thinking of 12, and she had said 10 would be better than 6 and 12 better than 10. And he had thought about that a long while and settled on 9. The distance his pride and his knowledge had managed to travel, but not 1 foot further. He framed it properly, posts sunk 2 feet into the floor, cross members at 4-foot intervals, and he drilled the ventilation according to the design he had watched her build and had asked her twice to explain again. He never once spoke publicly about the blizzard of '88, nor about the cellar he had called madness to her face. But that spring he sent Callan Morse over to help with Eleanor's planting 2 weeks of labor for which he named no reason and sent no bill, and Callan worked it through without comment because he understood in the way the young sometimes understand the things the old cannot say plainly, that the labor was a language Brandt had available to him when other languages were not. And Harold Brandt never charged Eleanor for lumber again as long as he lived. Edmund Hollis came in June with paper and asked her to draw out the ventilation in full, the dimensions of the pipes, the angle of the sliding covers, the placement of the 2 vents in relation to the door. He sat across her kitchen table with the deliberate attention of a man who had decided a thing mattered and meant to follow the decision carefully. And he copied down everything she drew and folded the papers into his coat. "There are 3 families north of here," he said, "who cannot afford to dig deep on their own. I mean to help them do it." She said that was good. "It will not bring back what they lost last winter," he said. "No," Eleanor said, "it will not. But they will not lose it again." He stood. "That is worth something." It was worth a great deal, Eleanor thought, though she did not say so. By the fall of 1889, 11 families in Beaver Creek had dug deeper cellars, and the talk around the general store and the feed barn had changed in its very nature. People discussed depth. Now the way they discussed roof pitch and chinking as a technical matter with a right answer, not a matter of preference and tradition and the way one's father had always done it. The number varied by family and soil and what timber a man could lay hands on, but the floor had shifted under the whole community. 6 feet was a minimum now. 8 was better. The bolder homesteaders were going to 10 and 12. No one in those conversations called it Eleanor's idea. No one named her directly. But when someone asked why a family had gone to 9 feet when 6 had always seemed plenty, the answer somewhere in it always touched on the winter of '88 and on what a cellar must be able to hold when the frost goes down further than any living man has planned for. Callan Morse filed his own homestead claim on the quarter section east of Eleanor's land in the spring of 1890. He was 20 by then, broad enough in the shoulder that his father's coat no longer hung loose on him, with the same pale, steady eyes and the same calloused hands he had brought up the road 3 years before behind a tired mule. He built his cabin in June and had his cellar dug to 10 feet by August ventilated on Eleanor's design. He married a Norwegian girl named Sigrid Halland from the next county in the summer of 1892. And Eleanor went to the wedding and sat near the back and ate cold chicken and dried apple cake and watched the boy dance with a contentment she recognized as the very thing she had hoped for. The morning she shook his hand over a half-dug hole. When their first child came in the spring of 1893, they named her Eleanor. She lived on her claim 11 more years after the winter that made her name in the county. She enlarged the cabin and improved the cellar and planted apple trees along Beaver Creek that never quite took to the prairie soil, being made by nature for gentler country, but that blooms stubbornly white every April. Regardless, because that is the kind of thing apple trees do when you give them enough time and ask nothing of them but to try. She died on a November evening in 1899 in the chair beside the south window, where the winter light came in best 64 years old. Callan found her the next morning when she did not come to the door at the hour they had agreed on, and he sat with her a while before he went for Clara Whitmore, because there was no urgency left in the situation, and it seemed right to sit with someone who had mattered to you rather than to rush straight off to the formalities. The ground was frozen. It was the Dakota Prairie in November, and the ground was what the ground always was. So Callan and Sigrid and the older Morse children carried Eleanor Voss down the ladder into her own cellar on the afternoon of the day she died and laid her on a board in the cool, still air. And the thermometer on the wall read 38 degrees, and the frost could not reach her. And the earth held steady around her the way it had held steady through the blizzard of '88 and through every winter since. They kept her there until April, when the thaw had finally gone deep enough, and then they buried her in the yard of her own claim under the stubborn apple trees. The trapdoor in the yard of the old Voss place lasted another 50 years. Farmers passing the property would sometimes stop and point it out to their children. The weathered wood, the leather hinges replaced twice, and then replaced again, the latter going down into the dark. And they told the story the way stories get told in country, where the land remembers things a little differently, every time the details drifting with each telling, but the heart of it never changing. The widow who dug while the whole county laughed. The blizzard that took everything. The cellar that held when nothing else did. They came to call it the Deep Vault. Eleanor Voss never once called it that. She called it what it plainly was, a cellar dug by a woman who had carried one memory for 15 years and would not let the frost take anything more she loved. She had not dug it to be proven right. She had not dug it to win anything from anyone. She had dug it because she had done the arithmetic the frontier demanded of everyone who meant to stay alive on it. And the arithmetic had told her one simple and brutal truth, that the whole margin between eating and starving was 8 degrees, and that between an 8-degree margin and nothing at all stood only the depth of the earth a person was willing to put between themselves and the cold. She had dug to get below the cold. The rest of it the empty sacks filled and carried home the families who came to dig deeper after her. The name that outlasted her by half a century was none of it anything she had set out to make. It was only what happens when a hard calculation turns out to be right, and the right answer turns out to matter to more lives than your own. And when the people of Beaver Creek dug their cellars in the years that followed the great blizzard, they went a little deeper than they strictly had to, past what seemed sufficient, past what their neighbors had done, past the comfortable point of reassurance and on into the territory of certainty. They did it because Eleanor Voss had done it first, and because they had seen with their own eyes what 15 feet of earth could hold, when all the world above it was trying to freeze everything that had not been buried deep enough. They dug a little deeper, just to be sure.